The radio crackled with static, then silence. In the operations center at Bagram Air Base, Afghanistan, 37 pairs of eyes stared at the overhead display showing 8 red dots moving steadily up a mountainside toward 4 blue ones. The blue dots weren't moving anymore. Reaper 6, this is Overwatch. Do you copy? The communications officer's voice carried the practiced calm that masked growing panic. Static answered back. He tried again. Reaper 6, radio check. Nothing. Colonel Marcus Webb rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of command settle deeper into his shoulders. SEAL Team 6 had been tracking a high-value target through the Hindu Kush for 18 hours. The intelligence was solid. Abdul Rashid, the bomb maker who'd been ghost dancing across 3 provinces, was finally cornered. But corners in Afghanistan had a way of becoming graves. "Sir, we lost comms with Reaper 6 12 minutes ago," reported Staff Sergeant Phillips, his fingers dancing across multiple keyboards. "Last GPS ping puts them on Ridge 394, approximately 2 clicks from the target building." The situation board painted a stark picture. 4 SEALs, call signs Reaper 6 through Reaper 9, were pinned down on a razor-thin ridge with nowhere to retreat. The terrain was unforgiving, a 1,000-foot drop on one side, vertical rock face on the other. Enemy forces were advancing from below, and thermal imaging showed at least 30 insurgents moving through the valley floor like ants converging on spilled honey. Webb's jaw tightened as he studied the topographical map. The ridge was a death trap, narrow, exposed, with no cover except scattered boulders that wouldn't stop a determined fly. The SEALs had chased their target into a perfectly orchestrated ambush. "What's our closest air support?" Webb demanded. "Apache flight is 20 minutes out, sir. F-16s are 45 minutes. 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours. The red dots on the screen were moving faster now, coordinated and deliberate. Someone down there knew exactly what they were doing. Then a voice cut through the tension, calm, measured, with just a hint of Oklahoma drawl. "Overwatch, this is Hog 1-1, approximately 15 miles southeast of your position. I've got eyes on your fireworks show." Webb's head snapped toward the communications station. "Hog 1-1, state your aircraft type and armament." "A-10C Thunderbolt, sir. 30 Mike cannon, full load of rockets, and a bad attitude toward people shooting at Americans." For the first time in 12 minutes, Webb allowed himself to breathe. The Warthog, ugly as sin, slow as molasses, and absolutely devastating to anything unfortunate enough to be on the receiving end of its attention. But the voice bothered him, something familiar about it. "Hog 1-1, what's your ETA to Ridge 394? 3 minutes, sir, already inbound." Webb frowned at the tactical display. There was no A-10 showing on their tracking system. The radio crackled again. "Overwatch, this is Hog 1-1. You might want to tell your boys to keep their heads down. I'm about to make some noise." Captain Artemis Jinx Kowalski leveled her A-10C Thunderbolt II at 8,000 feet, the twin General Electric turbofans humming their familiar song of destruction. Below her, the Hindu Kush stretched endlessly, a moonscape of granite and shadow painted silver by the full moon overhead. Her heads-up display showed the ridge in stark detail, 4 heat signatures huddled behind inadequate cover, while 30-plus hostiles closed in like wolves. She'd been running a routine patrol mission when the distress call crackled across emergency frequencies. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught her to recognize desperation, and Overwatch's barely controlled panic was textbook. SEALs didn't panic easily, which meant the situation was worse than bad. "Hog 1-1, Overwatch, what's your weapons load?" The controller's voice carried hope now, the first she'd heard since intercepting their communications. 1,100 rounds of 30 Mike, full rocket pod, and enough attitude to level a city block, Jinx replied, banking left to get a better angle on the ridge. Her targeting pod painted the scene in ethereal green, muzzle flashes blooming like deadly flowers as the insurgents advanced up the rocky slope. The A-10 wasn't built for beauty. 11 years of flying, the ungainly beast had taught Jinx that it was designed for one purpose: close air support. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon was essentially a flying gun with an airplane built around it, capable of firing depleted uranium rounds at 3,900 rounds per minute. It could punch through tank armor like tissue paper, which meant the rocky outcropping the insurgents were using for cover might as well be cardboard. Overwatch, I have visual on friendlies. 4 heat signatures approximately 200 meters north of the hostile group. Confirm blue force positions. Confirmed, Hog 1-1. Our boys are pinned behind the boulder field on the north side of the ridge. Jinx adjusted her attack vector, rolling inverted to get a clearer picture of the battlefield geometry. The SEALs were trapped on a narrow spine of rock barely wide enough for a mountain goat. Insurgents were advancing from the south, using the ridge's natural contours as cover. It was textbook small unit tactics, except the textbook hadn't counted on an A-10 dropping out of the clouds like an avenging angel. Overwatch, requesting clearance for close air support. Danger close authorization required. Static filled the radio for 10 seconds that felt like 10 hours. Jinx knew what they were thinking back at Bagram. Close air support at night, on a narrow ridge, with friendlies and hostiles separated by maybe 50 meters. It was either desperate or insane. Hog 1-1, you are cleared hot. Repeat, cleared hot. Danger close authorized. Jinx rolled wings level and pushed the throttles forward. The Warthog responded like a freight train gathering momentum, not fast, but inevitable. The first pass would be crucial. 30mm cannon rounds could kill friendlies just as easily as hostiles, and the margin for error was thinner than cigarette paper. But Jinx had walked this tightrope before, in places where American lives hung in the balance, and precision meant the difference between heroism and tragedy. She lined up her attack run, finger hovering over the trigger, and prepared to paint the mountainside with steel and fire. The GAU-8 cannon erupted like the voice of Zeus, sending a stream of depleted uranium rounds downrange at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Each round weighed almost a pound and carried enough kinetic energy to pulverize concrete. The distinctive BRRRRRAP of the Warthog's main gun echoed off the mountain walls, a sound that struck terror into enemy hearts and hope into friendly ones. Jinx's first burst lasted exactly 2 seconds and sent 60 rounds into the rocks where insurgents had been massing for their final assault. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Bodies disappeared in clouds of dust and debris. The carefully coordinated advance dissolved into chaos as surviving fighters scrambled for cover that no longer existed. Holy shit! The voice came over the emergency frequency, young, American, and very much alive. One of the SEALs had gotten his radio working. Hog 1-1, that was danger fucking close. Reaper 6, this is Hog 1-1. Glad to hear your voice, Jinx replied, banking left for another pass. How copy? Lima Charlie, Hog. You just saved our asses. We've got wounded, but we're combat effective. Jinx's targeting pod showed the results of her first attack. The insurgent advance had stopped cold, but thermal imaging revealed survivors regrouping in a series of caves about 400 meters down the slope. They'd learned respect for the A-10's cannon, but they weren't retreating. Reaper 6, I've got 30+ hostiles taking cover in cave systems south of your position. Looks like they're setting up for a long siege. Copy that, Hog. We're low on ammo and have 2 wounded. Can't hold this position much longer. The tactical situation was clear. The insurgents couldn't advance while Jinx was on station, but they didn't need to. Time was on their side. The A-10 would eventually run low on fuel, and when it left, they'd finish what they'd started. Unless Jinx could convince them that staying in those caves was a worse option than retreat. She selected her rocket pods and adjusted her attack angle. The Hydra 70 rockets weren't as precise as the cannon, but they packed enough explosive punch to turn cave mouths into sealed tombs. The key was placing them accurately enough to collapse the cave entrances without triggering rock slides that might reach the seal's position. Overwatch Hog 11, requesting immediate BDA on target caves. I'm going to close some doors. Hog 11 cleared to engage. BDA will follow your second pass. Jinx rolled into a shallow dive, the A-10's armored cockpit protecting her from small arms fire that sparkled against the mountain face like deadly fireflies. At 2,000 feet, she pickled off 4 rockets in rapid succession, watching as they streaked downward trailing cones of white fire. The explosions bloomed orange against the gray stone, each one precisely placed to collapse a cave mouth. Secondary explosions suggested ammunition stores detonating inside the tunnels. When the smoke cleared, 3 of the 4 caves were sealed. Overwatch direct hit on target caves. 3 confirmed collapses, 1 partially blocked. But thermal imaging showed movement in the remaining cave system. The insurgents weren't finished yet. Lieutenant Marcus, Hollywood, Rivera pressed his back against the cold granite and tried to stop the bleeding from his thigh. The bullet had punched clean through, missing bone and major arteries by millimeters. Lucky, considering the alternative was bleeding out on a mountain ridge in the middle of nowhere. "Jonesy, how's that shoulder?" he called to his teammate, who was hunched behind a boulder nursing his own wounds. "Functional, Petty Officer First Class Jonas Jonesy," Mackenzie replied through gritted teeth. "Bastards got me good, but I can still shoot." The 4-man SEAL team had been tracking Abdul Rashid for 3 days through terrain that made hell look hospitable. The intelligence had been solid, too solid, Rivera realized now. They'd been led into a trap as elegant as it was deadly. Rashid wasn't running from them, he was leading them to his friends. Chief Petty Officer Miguel Santos, call sign Reaper 6 and team leader, low-crawled between positions to check on his men. "Kowalski, you good?" Petty Officer Second Class Tommy Kowalski Nowak nodded, though his face was pale in the moonlight. "Just scratches, Chief, but we're running low on everything that matters." Santos did a quick inventory. 4 magazines of 5.56 between them, maybe 60 rounds total. 1 fragmentation grenade. A handful of flashbangs that wouldn't do much good in an open firefight. And about 2 hours until dawn brought helicopter extraction, if they lived that long. Then the A-10 had appeared like something out of a fever dream, its cannon tearing apart the mountainside with surgical precision. The pilot's voice carried calm confidence that seemed impossible under the circumstances. Rivera had heard enough close air support to know the difference between competent and exceptional. This pilot was playing in the major leagues. Reaper 6, Hog 11. I'm seeing movement in that remaining cave system. Looks like your party guests aren't ready to leave yet. Santos keyed his radio. "Copy, Hog. We're pinned down pretty good up here. Can't move without exposing ourselves to fire from that cave." "Roger that, Reaper 6. I'm going to try something creative. When I say move, I want you to haul ass to the ridge crest. There's a depression about 50 meters north that should give you better cover." Rivera exchanged glances with Jonesy. Moving meant crossing open ground while wounded under fire in the dark. It was either very brave or very stupid, and sometimes there wasn't much difference. "Hog 11, what's your plan?" Santos asked. "I'm going to put some 30 Mike rounds right at the cave mouth. Won't collapse it, but it'll keep their heads down for maybe 30 seconds. That's your window." 30 seconds to cross 50 meters of broken terrain while carrying wounded teammates. Rivera had run that distance in combat gear in less time, but that was before he'd taken a bullet in the leg. "Roger, Hog, we'll be ready on your call." The A-10's engines grew louder as it set up for another attack run. Rivera checked his rifle, made sure his remaining magazines were easily accessible, and prepared to trust his life to a pilot he'd never met flying an airplane that looked like it had been designed by a committee of pessimists. But that voice on the radio, steady, competent, unflappable, carried the kind of authority that came from experience. Jinx lined up her third attack run, this time planning for precision rather than destruction. The remaining cave mouth was partially collapsed but still passable, and thermal imaging showed at least 8 insurgents moving inside. They were smart enough to stay deep in the tunnel system, which meant she couldn't eliminate them with direct fire. But she could make their lives extremely unpleasant. The key was placing cannon rounds at the cave entrance with surgical precision, close enough to shower the interior with rock fragments and concussion, far enough away to avoid complete collapse that might trap the SEALs if they needed to use the cave system later for cover. Reaper 6 Hog 1-1, on my mark, move fast and move smart. I'll give you a 30-second window, maybe less. Roger. Hog standing by. Jinx rolled into her attack profile, the A-10's nose dropping toward the target. At 3,000 feet, she could see muzzle flashes from inside the cave as insurgents fired blindly at her approaching aircraft. Small arms fire against an A-10 was like throwing rocks at a tank, annoying but ultimately ineffective. The Warthog's titanium armor bathtub surrounding the cockpit had been tested against 23 cannon fire and found acceptable. AK-47 rounds bounced off like rain on a windshield. At 1,500 feet, she squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 spoke again, sending 40 rounds in a tight pattern around the cave mouth. Each impact sent up geysers of pulverized stone and smoke. The noise inside the cave would be deafening, the concussion disorienting. "Move," she transmitted. Through her targeting pod, she watched 4 heat signatures break from cover and sprint across the ridge. They moved like professionals despite their wounds, fast, low, using every scrap of available cover. One stumbled but kept going, supported by a teammate. The cave mouth erupted in muzzle flashes as insurgents recovered from the cannon attack and opened fire on the moving Americans. Tracers crossed the darkness like deadly meteors, but the SEALs were already diving into the depression 50 meters away. Hog 1-1, we're in position, Santos reported. Good shooting. But Jinx's fuel gauge was telling a different story. She had maybe 20 minutes of loiter time before she'd have to return to base. Not enough to provide continuous cover, and the insurgents knew it. They were already regrouping, probing for new attack routes. The radio crackled with a new voice. Hog 1-1, this is Apache 7-7, inbound to your position. ETA 12 minutes. Attack helicopters. The cavalry was finally coming, but 12 minutes was a long time in combat. Jinx adjusted her orbit to keep the cave mouth under observation while conserving fuel. She had enough ammunition for maybe 2 more gun runs before she'd be down to harsh language and unfriendly gestures. Apache 7-7, Hog 1-1, recommend you approach from the north. Hostiles are concentrated in cave systems on the south face of the ridge. Copy. Hog, thanks for keeping the bad guys honest. Honest was one way to put it. Colonel Webb watched the tactical display with growing admiration and unease. The A-10 pilot, this mysterious Hog 1-1 who'd appeared out of nowhere, had single-handedly turned a massacre into a manageable situation. But questions were multiplying faster than answers. Phillips, run that call sign through the database. I want to know who's flying that. The staff sergeant's fingers danced across his keyboard, pulling up flight manifests and aircraft assignments. His frown deepened as he scrolled through the data. Sir, that's unusual. Define unusual. Hog 1-1 is assigned to Captain Artemis Kowalski, but according to our records, she's grounded pending administrative review. Webb's blood pressure spiked. Grounded for what? Insubordination and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. She violated direct orders during a mission last month, sir. The pieces clicked into place. Webb remembered the after-action reports, the heated arguments in briefing rooms, the political fallout that had followed. Captain Kowalski had ignored explicit orders from higher command to avoid collateral damage, instead choosing to engage targets that threatened American ground forces. Her actions had saved lives but violated rules of engagement that had been crafted more for public relations than military effectiveness. "Sir, there's more." Phillips looked uncomfortable. Her aircraft was supposedly deadlined for maintenance. According to the maintenance logs, that A-10 shouldn't be airworthy. Webb stared at the tactical display showing the graceful orbit pattern of an aircraft that officially didn't exist, flown by a pilot who was officially grounded, saving the lives of SEALs who were officially never supposed to be in this situation. "Get me General Morrison on secure comms," he ordered. "Looks like Captain Kowalski decided to take an unauthorized flight." But even as he said it, Webb found himself hoping she could stay airborne long enough to finish what she'd started. Official channels and chain of command were important, but right now 4 Americans were alive because someone had decided that saving lives mattered more than following orders. The radio crackled with another transmission from the Rogue. "Overwatch, Hog 1-1. I'm showing movement in the valley floor, approximately 1 click southeast of the ridge. Looks like reinforcements." Webb's stomach dropped. Thermal imaging confirmed what the A-10 pilot had spotted: another 20 insurgents moving up the mountain, armed with heavy weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. The SEALs' temporary respite was about to become a full-scale battle. "Hog 1-1, can you engage the reinforcements?" "Negative, Overwatch. I'm low on fuel and ammunition. Need to save what I have left for immediate threats to the friendlies." Professional to the end, even while violating half the regulations in the book. Apache 77, Overwatch. Be advised, additional hostiles approaching from the southeast. Recommend you adjust your approach vector. Roger, Overwatch. We have them on thermal, beginning attack run now. Webb allowed himself a moment of relief. The helicopters were finally in range, and their Hellfire missiles would make short work of insurgent reinforcements. But his relief was tempered by the knowledge that one of his pilots was about to face a court-martial for saving American lives. Military justice, he reflected, was sometimes an oxymoron. The A-64 Apache helicopters materialized from the darkness like mechanical wasps, their rotors chopping the thin mountain air with menacing efficiency. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Kim, flying Apache 77, had been monitoring the radio traffic from 50 miles away, listening to the unfolding drama with professional interest that had gradually shifted to admiration. Whoever was flying that A-10 knew their business. The radio discipline was perfect, the tactical decisions sound, the execution flawless. Kim had flown close air support for 12 years and recognized exceptional skill when she heard it. 7-7, this is 7-8, came the voice of her wingman, Major Pete Ramirez. "I count 20 hostiles moving up the valley floor. Spread out, good discipline." Kim's targeting systems painted the insurgents in crisp detail. They were using proper small unit tactics, moving in fire teams with overlapping fields of observation. These weren't farmers with rifles. They were trained fighters who knew what they were doing. 7-8, I'll take the lead group. You handle the trailer. Roger that, 7-7. I have good tone on target. Kim selected a Hellfire missile and locked onto a cluster of insurgents near a rock outcropping. The missile's seeker head acquired the target with electronic satisfaction, and she squeezed the trigger. The Hellfire leaped from its rail with a flash of white fire, streaking downward at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. The explosion lit up the mountainside like a miniature sun. When the smoke cleared, the rock outcropping was a crater, and the insurgent advance had stalled. "Good hit, 7-7, splash 6 hostiles." But the survivors were already adapting, scattering into smaller groups and seeking cover among the rocks. Kim watched them disappear into crevices and caves like water seeping into stone. The valley floor became a maze of potential hiding spots, each one requiring careful observation and precise engagement. Hog 11, Apache 77, thanks for keeping the pressure on until we arrived. The A-10 pilot's response carried a hint of relief. Happy to help 77. I'm getting low on everything, so the party's all yours. Kim watched the ungainly Warthog orbit overhead, its pilot undoubtedly calculating fuel consumption and ammunition expenditure with the precision of an accountant. A-10 pilots were different from other aviators, more methodical, less flashy, focused on the mission rather than the glory. They flew an airplane that was older than some of their fathers, ugly as sin, and absolutely devastating to anything unlucky enough to be on the wrong end of its weapons. 7778. I'm tracking movement in grid 3947592. Looks like they're trying to flank the ridge from the east. Kim adjusted her position to get a better view. Sure enough, a group of insurgents was climbing a parallel ridge, probably planning to get high enough for plunging fire into the SEAL's position. It was tactically sound and potentially devastating. I see them, 7-8. Let's discourage their mountain climbing. The Apache's 30 chain gun could fire at 650 rounds per minute, each round designed to penetrate light armor and utterly destroy soft targets. Kim lined up on the climbing insurgents and squeezed the trigger. The results were immediate and final. Santos pressed against the cold granite and tried to assess their situation. The Apache helicopters had arrived like avenging angels, their missiles and cannon fire turning the valley floor into a moonscape of craters and debris. But insurgents were like cockroaches, hard to kill completely, and the survivors had scattered into hiding spots that would take hours to clear. Hog 11, Reaper 6, what's your fuel status? The A-10 pilot's response carried reluctant honesty. Reaper 6, I've got maybe 10 minutes before I have to head home. Apache flight can cover you until extraction. 10 minutes. Santos did the math. Helicopter extraction was still 90 minutes away, assuming the birds could find a landing zone that wasn't under fire. The Apache could provide fire support, but they couldn't loiter indefinitely either. Copy, Hog, thanks for the assist. Anytime, Reaper 6. You boys stay safe down there. Santos watched the A-10's navigation lights disappear into the darkness, heading southeast toward Bagram. The pilot had appeared out of nowhere, saved their lives, and vanished again like something out of a legend. He made a mental note to find out who'd been flying that Warthog and buy them a drink. Several drinks, actually. Chief, movement on the south face, Noek called softly. Looks like they're probing for another way up. Santos peered through his night vision scope. 3 insurgents were picking their way up a nearly vertical rock face, using cracks and ledges that would challenge a mountain goat. They were moving slowly but steadily, and if they reached the ridge, they'd have a perfect angle on the SEAL team's position. Apache 77, Reaper 6, I've got climbers on the south face of the ridge. Can you discourage them? Roger, Reaper 6, I see them. Stand by. The Apache's cannon spoke with mechanical precision, stitching a line of 30 rounds across the rock face. The climbers simply vanished, pulverized by high-explosive shells that turned granite into powder. Good shooting, 7-7. Threat eliminated. But Santos knew they were fighting a delaying action. Somewhere in the valley below, Abdul Rashid was probably organizing another attack. The bomb maker hadn't survived 3 years of American pursuit by being careless or giving up easily. This wasn't over. Rivera shifted position and immediately regretted it as pain shot through his wounded thigh. The bullet had done more damage than he'd initially thought, and walking to the extraction point was going to be a challenge. But SEALs didn't leave each other behind, and he'd crawl to the landing zone if necessary. Hollywood, how's the leg? Santos asked, reading his thoughts. I'll make it, Chief. Just need to avoid any foot races. The team's medic, Jonesy, had done what he could with field dressings and pressure bandages, but proper medical attention was still hours away. Rivera had been wounded before and knew the drill. Stay hydrated, keep pressure on the wound, and don't do anything stupid until the cavalry arrived. Unfortunately, their current situation seemed to require several varieties of stupid just to survive. Jinx banked toward Bagram, her fuel gauges painting an increasingly grim picture. The A-10's twin turbofans were efficient, but nearly 2 hours of combat maneuvering and full-power climbs had burned through her reserves faster than planned. She had enough fuel to reach base with maybe 5 minutes to spare, assuming no headwinds or unexpected weather. The radio crackled with updates from Apache 77. The helicopters were methodically hunting down the remaining insurgents, but it was slow work in the broken terrain. Each cave and crevice had to be checked individually, and thermal imaging could only reveal so much. Hog 11 Overwatch. Be advised, you are to report directly to Colonel Webb upon landing. Jinx's stomach tightened. She'd known this moment would come, had known it from the instant she decided to take off without authorization, but hearing it confirmed over the radio made it real in a way that abstract consequences never could. Roger Overwatch understood. She'd violated direct orders, stolen an aircraft that was officially grounded for maintenance, and engaged in combat operations while under administrative review. The fact that she'd probably saved 4 American lives wouldn't matter to the review board. Rules were rules, and she'd broken most of them. But listening to the SEALs' radio transmissions as they'd fought for their lives, she couldn't bring herself to regret the decision. Sometimes doing the right thing and following orders weren't the same thing. The lights of Bagram Air Base appeared ahead, a constellation of amber and white against the black Afghan landscape. Home, such as it was. Jinx began her approach checklist, running through the familiar ritual that would bring her A-10 safely to Earth. Behind her, Apache helicopters continued their deadly dance with insurgents who'd learned too late that Americans didn't abandon their own. The battle would continue for hours, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The SEALs would make it home. That had to count for something. She keyed her radio one final time. Reaper 6, Hog 11, keep your heads down and trust your Apache drivers. They know their business. Copy Hog, thanks for everything, we owe you one. Actually, Jinx reflected as she lowered her landing gear, they probably owed her a court-martial, but some debts were worth paying. Bagram Air Base materialized from the darkness like a small city, its runways and taxiways outlined in precise geometric patterns of light. After the wild terrain of the Hindu Kush, the base looked almost surreal in its orderly efficiency. A pocket of American civilization planted in one of the world's most hostile environments. Jinx lined up on runway 3, the A-10's engines humming with mechanical contentment as she reduced power for landing. The ungainly warthog was never graceful, but it was honest. What you saw was what you got, with no pretense of beauty or elegance. Just raw functionality wrapped in titanium armor and painted Air Force gray. The touchdown was smooth, years of experience compensating for the aircraft's inherent awkwardness. She rolled out long, letting the A-10 speed bleed off naturally rather than relying on the brakes. No point in stressing components that would need to be inspected anyway, assuming she ever flew again. Ground control vectored her to a parking spot near the maintenance hangars, where a small convoy of vehicles was already waiting. Military police, she noted with professional detachment. Colonel Webb wasn't taking any chances. Jinx shut down the engines and began her post-flight checklist with methodical precision. External lights off, radios to standby, weapons safe. The familiar routine helped calm her nerves, providing a framework of normalcy around what was about to become a very abnormal situation. A staff sergeant appeared at her cockpit as she completed her shutdown procedures. Captain Kowalski, Colonel Webb wants to see you immediately, ma'am. I'll be right there, Sergeant. She gathered her flight gear and climbed down from the cockpit, feeling the weight of 11 years of Air Force service settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. The maintenance crews were already swarming over her A-10, checking for battle damage and documenting every scratch and dent. They worked with the focused intensity of professionals who understood that attention to detail meant the difference between life and death. Chief Master Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, the squadron's senior enlisted maintainer, approached with his trademark scowl and a clipboard thick with inspection forms. "Captain, that bird was supposed to be deadlined for hydraulic issues." "Flew fine, Chief. Hydraulics worked perfectly." "That's not the point, ma'am, and you know it." Rodriguez's expression softened slightly. "Word is you saved some SEALs tonight." "Just did my job, Chief." "Your job was to stay on the ground pending administrative review." He paused, studying her face in the harsh light of the maintenance floods. "Good thing you're terrible at following orders." Despite everything, Jinx found herself smiling. Rodriguez had been maintaining A-10s since before she'd graduated from flight school, and his unofficial endorsement meant more than a dozen official commendations. The military police escort was polite but firm, guiding her toward a waiting vehicle. As they drove through the base, Jinx caught glimpses of the 24/7 operation that kept American forces supplied and supported across Afghanistan. Cargo planes taxied toward loading ramps, fuel trucks serviced helicopters, and maintenance crews worked under floodlights to keep the war machine functioning. All of it would continue regardless of what happened to one rogue A-10 pilot. Colonel Webb's office occupied a corner of the operations center, its windows providing a view of the flight line where aircraft arrived and departed with clockwork precision. Webb was waiting behind his desk, flanked by two officers Jinx didn't recognize, probably from the Inspector General's office or legal affairs. "Captain Kowalski, have a seat." Jinx settled into the chair across from Webb's desk and waited. She'd been in similar situations before, though never quite this serious. The key was to answer questions honestly and accept responsibility for her actions. "I suppose you know why you're here," Webb began. "Yes, sir. I violated direct orders and took an unauthorized aircraft into combat." "That's putting it mildly." Webb consulted a folder thick with documents. "You were specifically ordered to remain grounded pending the outcome of your administrative review. You ignored that order, somehow convinced maintenance to release an aircraft that was officially deadlined, and flew a combat mission without authorization or support." One of the unknown officers, a major with military justice insignia, leaned forward. "Captain, do you understand the seriousness of these charges? We're talking about possible court-martial, imprisonment, and dismissal from the service." Jinx met his gaze steadily. "I understand, sir." "Then perhaps you'd like to explain why you decided to throw away an 11-year career for one unauthorized flight." The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Jinx had been asking herself the same thing during the flight back to base, trying to find words that would make her decision seem rational instead of recklessly impulsive. "Sir, I heard the distress call on emergency frequencies. 4 Americans were about to die, and I was the only asset in range to help them." "That's not your decision to make, Captain," the major replied. "We have procedures, chain of command, proper authorization channels." "With respect, sir, those procedures would have taken time we didn't have. The SEALs needed help immediately." Webb studied her for a long moment. "Captain, you've been in the Air Force long enough to know that good intentions don't justify disobeying direct orders. We have regulations for a reason." "Yes, sir, I understand that." "Do you? Because your record suggests a pattern of insubordination and disregard for proper authority. Last month's incident wasn't the first time you've chosen to interpret orders rather than follow them." Jinx felt heat rising in her cheeks. The incident Webb was referring to had been a cluster from the beginning: bad intelligence, impossible rules of engagement, and American soldiers dying because politicians in Washington were more worried about CNN than combat effectiveness. She'd made a decision that night too, engaging targets that were technically off-limits but actively killing Americans. The after-action report had exonerate,